Welcome to the Strategy Skills Podcast. I'm your host, Krista Parova, and our podcast sponsor today is strategytraining.com. If you want to strengthen your strategy skills, you can get the overall approach used in well-managed strategy studies. It's a free download, and you can get it at firmsconsulting.com/overall approach. And you can also get McKinsey and BCG winning resume, which is a resume that got offers from both of those firms. And you can get it at firmsconsulting.com/resume PDF. And today we have with us an incredible guest, Lionel Barber, who is a former editor of the Financial Times. As editor, he interviewed many of the world's leaders in business and politics, including US Presidents Barack Obama and Donald Trump, Russian President Vladimir Putin, and he has co-written several books and has lectured widely on foreign policy, transatlantic relations and economics. And he also served on the Board of Trustees at the Tate and the Carnegie Corporation of New York. And he graduated in 1978 from Oxford University with a joint honors degree in German and modern history, and speaks French and German fluently and English. So incredible, 3 languages. Lionel, so great to have you with us.
It's great to be here. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
You've had one of the most distinguished careers in journalism. And looking back, what do you think were the key factors that made you successful?
Curiosity is the most important quality, I think, for a journalist. That you never think that you know everything, that you want to find out things, sometimes that people don't want you to find out. And then you tell stories and you're interested in people. So for me, curiosity, not cynicism, is the most important quality to have.
I agree. That is such a powerful quality to have. And it then allows you to constantly dig deeper and uncover things that other people would not uncover, either through research or your own critical thinking.
Yeah, and I've worked in many places abroad, in the country, in the UK. I mean, I started my career somewhat as an outsider in Scotland. I was English in Scotland in 1979. And that wasn't necessarily easy because there was a lot of strong Scottish nationalism around at the time. Seen as somebody from Oxford, a bit privileged. I don't think I did come from a particularly privileged background. My father left school when he was 14, 15, and he didn't go to university. My mother didn't go to college. So we weren't well off, but he was in journalism and he inspired me in that way. And then from Scotland, I worked in London, but then soon went to America. I worked there, worked at the Washington Post on a fellowship, worked as the Washington correspondent, and then in Brussels for 6 years. So I covered the end of the Cold War in America, and then I spent a bit of time in California, then went to Brussels, covering the whole European construction, the single currency, enlargement, and then took some executive jobs in London running the news operation, but also went back to America and covered Wall Street and ran the American operation before becoming the big boss, the editor in 2005. So I had a lot of foreign experience as a journalist. And then, as you say, as editor, I did 2 things, I suppose. One was to transform the Financial Times into a digital operation, going first and expanding the audience, but also then making it my business to interview leaders, because leadership has always fascinated me. So I did interview, everybody from Vladimir Putin to Trump to Modi in India to 2 Chinese premiers to Cyril Ramaphosa in South Africa. I traveled around the world as part of my job. And I think that gave me a different perspective and a better perspective as a person as well as a journalist.
Very few people have such an incredible career. I wish we could speak for a very long time and we could learn everything we could from you. And thank you so much for writing books, because that is one of the ways to learn from you. Although I would love to see a book about you as well.
Well, I did write a book which were my private diaries as the editor of the Financial Times between 2005 and 2020. It's got a rather strong title called The Powerful and the Damned, Private Diaries in Turbulent Times. And it captures the sort of challenges of editing a newspaper. I had one of the best journalist jobs in the world, editing the Financial Times during the global financial crisis, the Arab Spring, the new Cold War between America and China, the rise of authoritarianism and populism, all these trends. And of course, obviously, perhaps most important of all, this incredible technological revolution that we're in the middle of now and that we're seeing accelerate, which is transforming every aspect of human life. So all of that is in the book, and it's what I'm concentrating on now.
And that is already out, that book?
It is. I published the book, The Powerful and the Damned, in 2020. So a few months after I stepped down as editor. And you can get it in paperback. You can get it in Audible, read by me. And it's the sort of view from the catbird seat. It's got a lot of name dropping. It's got some humor. It's got some stories about how you manage journalists. I describe it as managing 550 brilliant anarchists.
I'm looking forward to reading it. Thank you so much for sharing this. Was there a specific moment in your career where everything changed for you? Maybe a decision or turning point that set you on the path to leading the Financial Times?
Well, the day I became editor, that certainly changed everything, because I was suddenly the big boss, and the buck stops with you when you're editor. I mean, if you're smart, you'll gather the best people around you, so you're capable of delegating, because nobody can do everything. So I made it my business to assemble the strongest team possible. It meant some changes. It made some difficult decisions necessary. But as I tell people, if you're the editor, you're not running a popularity contest. The most important thing is you're guardian of the gold standard of journalism, and you're responsible for excellence. And that means being fairly uncompromising, but it also means not being a dictator. You have to be an enlightened despot. How's that? A bit like Frederick the Great.
I think that there's a lot to think about there and explore. I can't wait to read your book on this. Many people struggle to stand out in their careers. So many of our listeners, they are very successful, but they want to have much bigger impact and much more influential roles within their organizations. Beyond curiosity, which is very important, what advice would you give to young professionals who want to make an impact in a competitive industry?
I would give several pieces of advice. The first is you need to have multiple skills. So you can't just be a writer. You need to understand the basics of coding. You need to be able to communicate across multiple platforms. You need to be able to go on video and audio. And you need to be able to understand data. So that's the first big change. You need to be sort of multitasking. The second is, I think it's always good to have mentors. Find people who can teach you some things and teach you where the traps are. Don't always be too much in a hurry. Be aware of what's going on around you, and find mentors. And then the last thing I would do is, many people find this hard, and I certainly found it hard initially, is that when you speak, you need to get people to pay attention, and you need to be able to command a room. And that means being very clear about what you're going to say, when you're going to say it. And if you have to give a public speech, then make it short, but train for it. And I think just one last piece which is linked is, a lot of people say to me, what's the best way to do an interview? What's the thing not to do? And I found this when I was interviewing very powerful people like Vladimir Putin, is you don't want to interrupt him all the time. You should let him speak, and then you should not be tempted to fill the silence. Let them fill the silence, because that way you get more time to think. You're not in a hurry, but you also put them more at ease.
Very powerful advice. And you can also use it even in your conversations, especially important conversations you have in personal and professional life.
That's quite right.
You mentioned commanding the room. For someone who is struggling with that, what advice could you give?
Breathe properly. So when you go into the room, make sure you've just inhaled a little bit in and out. Because if you're not breathing properly, the first words that come out of your mouth will sound awful. And then you can never recover. The second thing to do is always find out who is in the room. Because if you don't know who you're speaking to, you'll never make an impact. And the third thing is, when you start speaking, if there's a way of you looking at various people in the room. So don't just focus on one person, focus on several people. And if you recognize anybody, say early on. And as Jack or as Jane was saying just the other day, and then you've got the audience on side. And the most important thing is to work out, what do you actually want to say? And don't apologize. Don't say, I'll only be brief. Always find a way of finishing on a high note. So those are some of the tips.
Very, very powerful. Breathing, all of the things you said will make a huge difference. So I hope people will implement it starting today. You obviously led FT through massive shifts. You discussed some of it today. How did you personally manage change and uncertainty in such a fast-moving environment?
When I took over at the FT, the business model was broken. And I said that to the board. They were not very happy. But I said, it's true. We can't just rely on advertising. We need to become a subscription business. And I will deliver the journalism which will make people happy to pay for the journalism. But you need to figure out how this new business model will work of subscription. The second thing I thought was, well, my predecessor kind of messed up a bit. He wasn't that good. So I'm surely going to be able to do better than that. And the third is that if you're a general in an army, you're leading an army, and the army just wants to know which direction to march. It probably doesn't know the right direction. And maybe the general doesn't know a right direction. But as long as you're not marching to Moscow in winter, because that's not so good, you need to set a sense of direction to the troops and be clear about that. And then the last point, which was a very good piece of advice given to me by Sir Howard Stringer, who at that time was the head of Sony, a Welsh American, first foreigner to lead Sony, the consumer electronics giant. And I said to him, what advice would you give me? And he said, you're going to embark on a big period of change. So whatever you do, you need to be very clear that you need to articulate the message of change all the time, because you'll think that you've got the message across after 2 times, but actually you won't have even persuaded these journalists and 10 times or maybe 12 times. So you have to keep repeating the message of why change is necessary, how it's going to happen. Think of a few phrases. And that's what I did. I talked about digital first. I talked about the importance of a return to the gold standard. And by repeating these phrases, suddenly all the other journalists started repeating them, and you started getting the army to march in the right direction.
Do you think that subscription model is still relevant because what happened is there were so many subscriptions, so many people went into subscription models that customers then had too many subscriptions, then they started cutting it out.
Well, it's more challenging now. Everybody's gone that route. But first of all, there's first mover advantage. And the second is it all comes down to the brand, doesn't it? And if you've got a very powerful worldwide brand like the Financial Times, I think you're going to get a certain amount of customer loyalty. But you need to be incredibly careful to get the best talent and to focus on the right subjects so that people feel very attached to the brand. And at the Financial Times, if you think of the weekend, people really like reading it at the weekend. It's an incredibly valuable product. It's where, we charge £5 in the UK. It's incredible. But there are things like Lunch with the FT, other features of the weekend, the essays and the columnists. All this needs to be constantly kept happy and fresh in order to make the proposition. Now, it may be true that the subscription model needs to be adapted a bit. And it's certainly correct that, the subscriptions pile up. But then you need to think about what are the other ways of doing it. It's not my challenge now. The fact is that the FT, we completely transformed the business with subscription because we doubled the audience and we got doubled the paying audience through digital. But I think probably adding some extra products, value-added products around that brand, maybe conferences and clubs help a bit, also generate revenue. But fortunately, I don't have to worry about it now. I did my bit. It took nearly 15 years.
Yes, you did more than enough for that organization. How do you stay sharp and informed and continue developing yourself? Anything you will be comfortable sharing that people could potentially adapt for themselves?
First, I'm very competitive. I hate being beaten. But I also said, I don't want to be first. I want to be right. I want to be correct. And the more experience you get, we did some huge stories, particularly towards the end of my tenure as editor, particularly the Wirecard exposure. And if you haven't seen that documentary Skandal, that sort of tells the story of the investigation into this Germany's Enron. A huge financial scandal, $2 billion of losses, that money that disappeared. One of the top executives now in financial fugitive in Russia. He was running half a spy operation. It was the most incredible story. And we'd never been able to do that if it hadn't been for, putting a lot of preparation in first. But I loved that kind of reporting, and that kept me sharp. I think making sure that you bring in new people who challenge you, that keeps you sharp. And the third piece of advice, apart from, because when you bring in people, you can't just bring in lots of people. I used to describe it as having a skin graft. So you weren't having a heart transplant, it was a skin graft. So you bring in somebody and try and socialize them, get them used to the culture of the Financial Times, and then tap their expertise. But lastly, I would urge any leader to go into the gym. I used to run 4K twice a week without fail. And if I got under 18 minutes, I knew I was as sharp and I was ready to go into battle. And just do some weights, just have some downtime. And if you have a partner and they're prepared to be patient, that helps too, because you can't have all the knowledge and all the pressure stored up in your own brain. You'll go crazy.
And it's interesting when you start exercising, all other areas of your life improve as well.
I think it's really important. I do cycling as well. I don't do the 4K on the machine so easily, but I walk at least 10,000 steps a day still. I cycle. I could play a bit of tennis. I think all of that kind of exercise is important so that you don't just get stuck in front of the computer, that you're out and doing physical as well as mental exercise.
We spoke earlier about subscriptions, and I wanted to ask you, so you obviously did a remarkable job figuring out how do you transition, how do you adapt to changing times. For someone who's listening to us right now and they feel that their business is dying because the world has changed and they have to find another business model, are there any ways you can recommend they follow to kind of think about it, to maybe see something they're not seeing right now?
Well, if your business is dying, the question is, are you aware it's dying, or are you, in effect, Mr. Kodak or Madame Kodak, where the camera business is completely, and they thought they could make the best camera and that would save the business, and it didn't. So the question is, at what stage are we? Are we on the way to the funeral parlor, or are we still got 2 or 3 years to go? If you're on the way to the funeral parlor, that's pretty difficult. You have to exercise some very, very powerful changes. You probably do need to reduce costs, but you can't cut your way out of trouble. So I think probably the way I look at it is, what is the core of your business that you think is the most valuable? And is there any way that you're neglecting that because you're trying to do too many other different things? Is there any way of going back to the core and slightly changing that? Is it a distribution problem? Is it a pricing problem? And then is there anything that, a friend of mine pivoted from tobacco to luxury. That's pretty counterintuitive, but he had the money, and the tobacco business at that time was still profitable and making quite a lot of money. So he had the money to reinvest in a luxury brand's business. So again, it's a question of, how big is your business, how the scale. And then maybe lastly, ask your workforce, what should we be doing next? Again, you don't necessarily have a monopoly on wisdom.
Wise words. You recently wrote a book, and you, of course, covered so many influential figures during your career. Why did you choose to write about Masayoshi Son specifically?
Because so much money is involved in the Masayoshi Son story. Not tens of millions or hundreds of millions, but billions of dollars. Billions of dollars made when he was investing in the likes of Yahoo or Alibaba, the Chinese internet giant, but also billions of dollars lost in the dot-com bubble during the COVID pandemic. And this guy, Masayoshi Son, there's no Western biography of him until he's from Japan, he's Korean Japanese, we'll come to that, it's very important because he's an outsider in his own country. I decided there was no Western biography of Masayoshi Son, so I was opening a new market, and I was sure I was going to find some great characters and stories built around these billions of dollars.
And I'm very familiar with what it is like to be an outsider in your own country. Because when I was growing up in Russia, I didn't have Russian name. My father wasn't Russian, so no one seen me as Russian. People would write on the walls, "Get out of Russia," when I was a child, beating my father outside the apartment building. So I really understood what he felt.
So what's your last name again? Just remind me.
Safarova.
Safarova, which is not Russian.
Yes, my father is from Azerbaijan.
I see. Exactly. So, look, Masayoshi Son, that's two names. Masayoshi is Japanese and Son is Korean. And when he was growing up, his family had a Japanese name, Yasumoto. But Masa wanted to have, he didn't want to live undercover. He wanted to come out and be his own person. So I think that was a massive motivation for him to overcome his second-class citizenship, his second-class status. And he did it by actually leaving for America when he was a teenager and going to Berkeley in California. So that's where he learned his English properly and where he came to grips with the microchip internet revolution, not the internet, but microchip, which was sort of the technological foundation for his successes as businessman.
And it is incredible how he realized he needed to go to US.
Well, his family didn't want him to go to the US because, remember, his father had grown up in a shanty town, in a slum, a Korean slum, after the war. And while he was a teenager, he left school at 14. His father was a bootlegger, a pig breeder, a loan shark, and then made his fortune in pachinko gambling, which is this kind of semi-underworld activity of slot machines, which the Koreans got into because that was the only area where they were really permitted to work. They couldn't work as teachers, they couldn't work in the police force or in the local government or anything like that because they were Korean. So, they could have done if they naturalized and become Japanese, but if they wanted to stay Korean, then they were right on the fringes of society. But Masayoshi Son said, I don't want to go into slot machine gambling. I want to go into the business of my choice. And he decided to go into software distribution. And that was an idea that came to him when he was a student at California.
What surprised you when you were doing research for this book?
I thought he had a slightly better sense of humor than I imagined. I mean, he does like to joke. I think it's a bit of a theater act. The second thing that surprised me is I couldn't believe how his risk appetite was ginormous. I mean, this is a man who's bet the company numerous times. He's prepared to do things that most people just wouldn't have the stomach for the risk. And then I think there were things that I found extraordinary about, his ambition. I mean, he wanted to be number one, not just in Japan, but in the world. He's an empire builder. He's compared himself seriously to Napoleon.
And his father used to tell him that he is genius.
Yeah, it does do all sorts of odd things to you if you're told aged 5 that you're a genius. I mean, you do feel a bit like a princeling. You think you're right. And I think he did have a very inventive mind. I mean, he was telling his father how he could get more business at the restaurants that he owned. And he claims to have been able to understand the principle of discounting in order to grow your market. So all these things marked him out as something special. And you do have to remember that he set up his own business in Japan and he couldn't get a bank loan. Nobody would lend him credit. So he had to rely on a mentor. I was talking about the importance of mentors earlier. And his mentor basically said, I am ready to mortgage my house so that you can get a loan. I'll guarantee the loan via my house. That's pretty amazing.
It is amazing. Even many parents would not do it for you.
Yeah, there you go.
What do you think is different about his decision making? How does he make decisions differently from most people?
I think he really can go just on the gut. I mean, he did meet Jack Ma of Alibaba and he made a decision to invest $20 million, later $100 million into Alibaba. And Alibaba was only a few months old. Goldman Sachs had put some money in, but he just went in and all his Chinese people present, the fellow investors, said, no, we don't want to put money in Jack Ma, but he felt in his gut that that was the right thing to do. And of course, he was spectacularly right. He's always gone with the gut. I mean, he got it wrong with Adam Newman of WeWork, but he got it right with Jerry Yang, the co-founder of Yahoo. So he does things with conviction. He is really prepared to take risk. And he's also prepared to take a lot of losses up front in order to grow the market. So he's a sort of early Amazon business model, or a bit like Rupert Murdoch and B Sky B satellite broadcasting. You know, go for think about total market access ability, and then think about your profit and loss account. He's always been interested more in revenue than actually P&L.
There was a book sometime back called Flying Without a Net, about people who are very hard on themselves when they make mistakes. And my hypothesis is that Masa, as you call him in the book, and I guess his family calls him that, he's not that afraid to make a mistake. He doesn't punish himself for mistakes. He doesn't punish himself for mistake, and therefore it is easier for him to make these big bets. Do you think there's something there?
Oh, I think it's that, absolutely, because he says, well, I made that decision. I live with it. I mean, that's what I did. What am I supposed to do? He also would say, if you come from nothing, and by the way, he was only poor for a few years. I mean, once his father got into pachinko gambling, or even before, you know, they were quite well off. So they didn't spend a lot of time in the slum. He likes to play that up. But if you know that your parents have had nothing, then if you lose everything, you just go back to nothing. And that was what you were like. So I think he has that sort of philosophy. I do think that he likes to pretend that he's really sorry he made the mistake. And he goes and does penance. He retires from public view. But actually, he's just plotting his comeback.
Do you think that people who have this very strong feeling of making a mistake and then they punish themselves for it, do you think it is one of the key things that is holding them back?
I do, because I would cite, and I remember listening to Jeff Bezos when he first said this, he distinguished between good failure and bad failure. And bad failure is when you keep doing the same thing. I mean, you know you've made the mistake, so why are you doing the same thing over and over again? You've given the person the job, they've messed up. I mean, why put them through the same problem? Or you've adopted this approach and it didn't work, so why go back to it? I think there's good failure where you're trying very hard to do something and it just doesn't come off for various reasons. That's okay, you learn. As long as you learn from, that's good failure. So distinguishing between the two is very important.
It probably comes back to the time when he was growing up and he was his father's potentially favorite son.
Yeah, he was the favorite son, yeah. Second son.
Yes, he was told that he's genius. So when you're treated that way by parents, then you kind of use that same model for the way you treat yourself throughout the rest of your life.
I think that is true, that he considers himself something of a genius. And he would cite his father. His father told me when I interviewed him, aged 87 in the family home. And the family home is full of photographs of the father and the son, often wearing baseball caps. And it's a bit like a shrine. It's extraordinary. But the father was so proud of his son that his son had become a mega billionaire. And, he'd been rich, but his son had become super rich. So I think this privileged status, this sense that you are a princeling and a genius, that does encourage you to take risks, but it can also lead to sometimes, I think, reckless behavior.
It is something that those listeners who are parents need to think about, to what degree they need to tell their children that they are number one. How do you balance them having the self-confidence, but at the same time not being reckless?
Yeah, it's tricky because obviously if you're going to make a bet on something and you've done a certain amount of homework, then, sometimes you're going to fail. I do quote in the book Thomas Edison. It's one of my favorite quotes, because Masa is constantly talking about his vision, and it's a technocentric vision. It's one that essentially says, I understand the path of technology and the essence of technological progress. But as Thomas Edison said, vision without execution is hallucination. So execution is really important. And sometimes Masa has not paid enough attention to the execution. He's been carried away by the founder, just the vision. So think about the execution.
If you would summarize the key things people could learn from Son, what would you say?
Think about making money not just as an innovator, a great innovator like Steve Jobs. You can make a lot of money as a middleman or a middlewoman. You can position yourself, for example, like Masa, as somebody who is the gateway to Japan and China for the Americans. He did that brilliantly because he spoke English, but he understood the Japanese domestic market. I think also the power of FOMO. I mean, use the fear of missing out to get people to come on board or invest in you, because they'll give you money if they think they're going to miss out on a great opportunity. And Masa is amazing at giving that sense of fear of missing out. That's how he got all the money from the Saudis for the Vision Fund, $45 billion. That's how he got money from older people, that he could talk a great game about what was coming. And people needed to give him money because he knew the future. He could see it. But obviously at the same time, I think he showed some management weaknesses. Obviously the Japanese contingent is very loyal, but some of the more other mercenary types, there was a lot of infighting, and that did a lot of damage to the company's reputation. So I always wondered, if he is the big boss, you should have sorted that out a bit earlier.
I wanted to wrap up with two questions outside of this topic. One is, are there specific routines, success habits, so to say, that you follow on a daily or weekly basis that really help you be an incredible professional that you are?
Well, I do think that the exercise point is really important, and still doing that, so your mind is fresh. I think don't get into a comfort zone. Always be thinking, well, I'm doing quite well now, but there must be some way of I can do better or look at things differently. And that means you've got to be open to other people, that you don't just say it's my way or the highway. I know what I'm doing. I mean, obviously, as the editor, when you're making big decisions about stories, even though I knew what I thought we should do, and, we were being legally challenged, for example, on Wirecard, a couple of times I just brought in colleagues to find out what they thought. But I was also testing them to think about how good they were and whether their judgment was good. And at that time, I was planning succession, which is the last point, that if you're a leader, any responsible leader has to think about succession. So, by the way, a question that Masayoshi Son, the founder of SoftBank, that employs thousands of employees, but there isn't an obvious successor, and we don't know what's going to happen to SoftBank when he passes, or I don't think he will hand the reins over.
Thank you. And the second question I wanted to ask, the last question for today, is over the last few years, or even any amount of time you want to consider, what were maybe 2-3 aha moments, realizations that really changed the way you look at life or the way you look at business?
One of the important challenges for the Financial Times was, were we going to go with our new app into the Apple Store? And that would have meant handing over all our data to Apple and also paying them 30% of our revenues for our subscriptions gained through the app. And so we decided that we would not do that. We admired Apple. Apple is an incredible company. It continues to be an incredible company with incredible products, consumer products, Their stock price, their valuation is amazing. But we decided we're not going to be part of that. We're going to be confident enough in our brand that we won't succumb to that distribution problem and hand over essentially the gold data, which is the consumer. We weren't going to be disintermediated. And you know what? We got an enormous amount of respect from consumers and friends of the FT. We made new friends because we were prepared to sort of stand up to the big guy, a very impressive big guy, but a big guy. And so I think occasionally standing up to big, powerful things is a good thing to do. I think the second issue was, on Wirecard, this was cost a lot of money to defend. We had legal bills, but I understood that I did my due diligence with the reporters. I knew the reporters very well, and therefore I was prepared to have a fight. And I was prepared to pay and get the board to understand that this was going to cost a lot of money. But in the end, the FT was going to be right. It was going to be absolutely a fantastic story. And as a result of having, again, a fight, a difficult one, but the value of sticking to your guns and backing the reporters had immeasurable value to the organization and to the culture. And when you're thinking about very important things for a company like recruitment and retention, and I think they're very important for an editor because it's all about talent. If you do something like that, which is obviously courageous, and you're also right, you're going to get 10 times the amount of benefits.
Lionel, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate all your work and can't wait to read your book about your time being an editor. Where can our listeners learn more about you, buy your book, anything you want to share?
Well, you can follow me on Twitter. I have about 108,000 followers. They seem to have gone down for some reason since Elon Musk took over Twitter, X. But there we are. But there's still quite a lot of people who follow me. I'm also on Instagram at Barber Lionel. And I'm on Blue Sky, same Lionel Barber, and I'm on LinkedIn because I think LinkedIn is a very effective way of communicating to people. And so I offer my views. You can listen to a media podcast that I do every week called Media Confidential with Alan Rusbridger, the longtime former editor of The Guardian. So it's two experienced ex-editors talking about the media. And then you can follow some of the writing that I do, sometimes for the Financial Times or the Spectator, and do read, above all, the new book, Gambling Man, the secret story of the world's greatest disruptor, Masayoshi Son, first Western biography of one of the most consequential investors of our time.
Thank you, Lionel. Our guest today again has been Lionel Barber. Check out Lionel's book. It's called Gambling Man, The Secret Story of the World's Greatest Disruptor, Masayoshi Son. And our podcast sponsor today is strategytraining.com. If you want to strengthen your strategy skills, you can get the overall approach used in well-managed strategy studies. It's a free download, and you can get it at firmsconsulting.com/overall approach. And you can also get McKinsey and BCG winning resume, which is a free download, and you can get it at firmsconsulting.com/resume PDF. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and I'm looking forward to connect with you all next time.